You know, when we think about epic military victories, we usually picture these brilliant generals or heroic soldiers on the battlefield. But the Roman conquest of Gaul, well, it really hinged on something else entirely. Today, we're going to dig into the Siege of Alesia. And we're not just looking at it as a battle, but as this absolute masterclass in how logistics and engineering, the stuff that's usually behind the scenes, pulled off one of the most incredible victories in all of history. So let's just start with the big question. How in the world do you defeat two giant armies at the same time when you're the one trapped in the middle? I mean, it sounds impossible, right? Well, this was the exact situation Julius Caesar found himself in back in 52 BCE. He was about to be caught in a pincer movement of truly epic proportions. And his solution? Well, it was going to change warfare forever.
Okay, so to really appreciate the genius of what the Romans did, we have to understand just how desperate their situation was. I mean, they were in deep. Caesar had pushed way into hostile territory, and finally all the Gallic tribes had united against him.
And this kind of gives you a sense of the sheer scale of the problem. You've got Caesar's army, maybe 50,000 soldiers, laying siege to this Gallic force that's holed up in the fortress of Alesia. But here's the kicker. The real threat wasn't the army in the fortress. It was what was coming for them, a colossal Gallic relief army, summoned from all over Gaul, marching to literally crush the Romans against the city walls. You've got to hand it to the Gallic chieftain, Vercingetorix. This was a brilliant move. He knew he couldn't beat the legions in a straight-up fight, so instead, he forced Caesar into this horrible dilemma. Either you give up the siege and admit you've lost, or you stay and face total annihilation from two sides. He was flipping the script, turning Caesar's own siege into a death trap. So what does Caesar do? Well, his first move involves what most people think is the most boring part of war, logistics. But you see, for the Romans, this wasn't boring at all. It was their superpower. It was this invisible machine that kept the whole army running. It even had a name, the Annona Militaris. And we're not just talking about packing some extra snacks here. This was a highly sophisticated, super organized system for getting everything the army needed, grain, tools, weapons, you name it, across hundreds of miles of enemy land. It was the absolute lifeblood of the campaign. And what's so cool is how it actually worked. They were shipping supplies all the way from Italy, using this network of roads and rivers to move everything. They set up these fortified supply depots all over Gaul so everything was safe. So even while Vercingetorix was using a scorched earth strategy, trying to starve them out, this system just kept humming along, keeping the Roman war machine fed and ready to fight. All right, with the supply lines taken care of, Caesar unleashes part 2 of his plan. And this was anything but invisible. In fact, it was one of the most ridiculously ambitious construction projects in military history. He was literally going to build his way to victory. 23 miles. Just let that sink in for a second. That is almost the length of a marathon. 23 miles of walls, ditches, and towers that Caesar's legions built by hand in just a few weeks, all while being surrounded by the enemy. It's just an absolutely staggering achievement. The plan was genius. First, they built an inner wall, called the circumvallation, facing inwards to keep Vercingetorix and his army trapped inside Alesia. Then, they built a second, even bigger wall, the contravallation, facing outwards to defend against that massive relief army. The Romans had turned the tables completely. They went from being the besiegers to being inside their own fortress, ready to fight a war on two fronts.
And the ground between these two walls? Oh, it was a total death trap. They dug thousands of these camouflaged pits they called lilies. Each one had a fire-hardened stake at the bottom just waiting for you. A charging enemy would literally get swallowed by the earth.
As if that wasn't enough, they also hammered thousands of small iron-tipped stakes called spurs into the ground. They were designed to maim the feet of anyone trying to charge, basically slowing a full-on assault to a painful, bloody crawl.
And to complete this absolute nightmare of a battlefield, they just scattered these things called crow's feet everywhere. These are 4-pronged iron spikes, made so that one point is always facing up. They'd cripple men and horses alike. I mean, they had literally weaponized the ground itself. So, you've got this invisible supply machine keeping everyone fed, and this immense engineered fortress keeping everyone safe. Now we get to the main event. This is where those two things come together in perfect synergy to win a completely impossible war. And then It happens. The moment of truth arrives. The huge Gallic relief army just slams into the outer walls. At the exact same time, Vercingetorix's starving army storms out of Alesia to hit the inner walls. The Romans are caught, exactly as planned, fighting for their lives in both directions. So here's the crucial part. How did they survive this? Well, every single challenge was met by this incredible one-two punch of logistics and engineering. You need to keep your soldiers fighting. The nona militaris keeps the food and tools flowing, while the engineered camps give them a secure place to rest. You need to stop that giant relief army. You have well-fed defenders fighting from behind that massive wall and its fields of traps. You need to keep Vercingetorix pinned down. The inner wall holds firm, while you know the Gauls inside are slowly starving. It was a perfect, deadly system.
The thing is, the victory at Alesia wasn't just the end of one battle. The consequences were absolutely massive. It basically set the stage for the entire next chapter of Roman history and created a blueprint for building an empire.
Once that massive, united Gallic army was defeated, the will to resist was just shattered. This single victory effectively ended a war that had been raging for nearly a decade. And just like that, the huge, resource-rich territory of Gaul was now under Roman control. But the legacy goes so much deeper. The conquest of Gaul obviously massively expanded Rome's power and influence. But maybe more importantly, the methods they used here, this unbelievable fusion of relentless logistics and bold engineering, became the standard playbook. It became the textbook example of Roman siege warfare for centuries to come. And that kind of leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on, doesn't it? Alesia proved that battles can be won long before the first sword is even drawn. So it makes you wonder, how many modern conflicts are really decided not by the soldiers on the front line, but by the quiet, unseen superiority of supply chains, of technology, of systems? The architecture of victory, it turns out, is often invisible.